Hey guys, this is Pepper Repair A here. I'm coming at you with some Diablo 4 this time. I've got a pretty good start to a build going that I'm hoping to make even greater. It is a Berserking Bleed Barbarian build. Uh, been having really nice luck with the way I have this one set up right now. I am still tweaking it, and I'm only level 45 on World Tier 2. So, I still have a ways to go.
It wasn't her.
So,
The corruption took her. I saw it.
so just bear with me. But I do believe that y'all will like this build. It is very fun, and it flows really nicely. So, let's get into it. First, let's get into the skills, and then we'll go to the armor. As for my skills, as you can see here, I have Flay, which I am using a basic attack. My basic attack is actually pretty good. It helps me keep vulnerable on my targets, and helps keep building my bleed up even more when some of my other skills are on cooldown. I have my key skill, that is my damaging skill on this build, is Rend. I am doing a lot of damage with Rend. Rend puts my bleed damage up there very high, and sometimes I can just walk away from the target and let it bleed to death. I'm using Rallying Cry to keep me some fortify and get my resource generation and some movement speed up. Also gives me unstoppable, so I can get out of a tight bind if I need to. Ground Stomp, I'm using it to basically keep my stun my enemies to get more damage, because I'm using some stun perks to get some damage up, which we'll go about in a minute. Um, I'm also using it to help generate a big chunk of fury all at once and very quickly. Next, I'm using Warcry. My Warcry to get me more damage and again some more movement speed, because I will be using Berserking. So it gives me Berserking, and I'm also using it to increase my damage even further by if I have more than 6 enemies on me at a time, which quite a few times I am. On to the next main skill I'm using, which would be Charge, which gives me a good skill, which is a secondary skill to give me unstoppable. So now I have 2 unstoppable skills, so I can get out of binds pretty easily. But also, this is a good skill for starting a fight with this build, because the way I have it set up is that it makes enemies vulnerable. So it's very nice. And then if I hit them into a wall, it gives them stunned as well, so it makes them stunned. I am not using an ultimate skill or a weapon mastery skill on this build. They don't flow right. They're not flowing with the build itself. So we have to work around that. So my in that turn, I'm using the Warcry as my ultimate, considering its cooldown is only 25 seconds. And if you look at the Wrath of the Berserker, which would be a berserking skill, it's 60 seconds. So, in turn, I'm using it to be able to cast berserking more often, get my berserking stayed up more often, so I don't have to worry about my berserking going down. So my key passive, I'm using the unconstrained, the berserking perk, to increase my berserking damage and increase its duration. This actually was a later change in this build. At first, when I first started out this build, I was using Gushing Wounds, but it later on it started to wane on how good it was for me, and I haven't found anything that makes this better to do more the better scale with my build than the Berserking one. Okay, so now for passives, let's go back up to the top. For passives, we're going with Endless Fury, because I'm using two-handed weapons. I'm using two-handed slashing weapons at that, and that's pretty much my main damage source. I'm not really using any of the other weapons that much. They're just used there for passive bonuses on my other weapons. So I'm using that. I got that fully up so I can generate Fury very quickly. On my next one, I'm using the Thorns. I have maxed out my Thorns, and I have maxed out the Toughest Nails. So Outburst and Toughest Nails both maxed out. They work very well, and they actually help you get even more bleed on your enemies. So you get a lot, and you have quite a bit of health with this build. You don't have like, you're not using the health bonuses, but it's not really seeming that potent. So I do have 1 point into Booming Voice, just to give me a little bit more duration on my shouts, which like I said, I'm only level 45. So I may boost that, I may max that on out to give me a lot longer duration on it. But that's depending on whether I want to use more perks on Charge or Warcry. Now on top of that, my Berserking perks, I will be using Aggressive Resistance to get me some damage reduction. I am going to go ahead and max this out, so I know I have at least 2 skills going to this to get me some more damage reduction while I'm Berserking, because you're going to be in the thick of it. In this, you're going to be in the middle of crowds, in the middle of everything, doing massive damage. Bosses, it's been chewing through bosses like it's nothing. As long as you got to be careful with area of effect attacks, but other than that, most of the time I have not had much issue. I'm using the Battle Fever, to give my charge the ability to give me Berserking as well as my Warcry. So now I have 2 skills that give me Berserking, which helps out very much. And then just for a little bit of added Fury generation while I'm Berserking, I put Prolific Fury. On top of that, I have Pit Fighter. We all know there's a lot of builds that use Pit Fighter. Just for a little bit extra bonus on damage reduction and dealing damage. And then I put Slaying Strikes to give me more damage to injured enemies. On top of that, I do have, I'm mainly using great swords, but I will swap between a great sword and an axe from time to time, depending on what I get. And this helps keep the damage going from a healthy enemy down to an injured enemy. And then down on the bottom, towards the ultimate section, we are using heavy-handed to give my critical strikes more damage. I'm already using a great sword, so my critical strike damage is increased, but this increases it even further. That's pretty much it for the skills. If you want to, so my skill lineup, primary attack, and then basic attack. This is pretty much how I use it. So pretty much what I do normally when I come into a group of enemies, I will hit charge to group them all together, because I will be using the seasonal aspect to create ancients, 4 ancients that will travel with you to help you group the enemies together. Then I will cast Rallying Cry, Stomp to stun the enemies that are all grouped up, and then I will cast my Warcry. I'll start attacking with Flay, and then I'll start hitting them with Rend, because once I hit them with Flay, I get a little bit increased bleeding damage after using Flay. So when enemies take direct damage from Flay, they take 10% increased bleeding damage for 3 seconds. So if I hit the whole group of enemies with Flay, I can then massively increase the bleeding when I use Rend. And if they happen to proc vulnerable with it as well, then it increases the vulnerable duration with the Rend, so I can just keep it up. And most of the time I can pretty much empty my Fury with Rend and then build it back up, and I usually get 2 full rounds with Rend before the enemies are unstunned. Which sometimes you don't even have to worry about that, because if you can use charge to smash the group of enemies into walls, you can save your stomp till right when they come out of stun, and then you can restun them again. It doesn't always work with elites, because as you know, elites become unstoppable once they're stunned so much. So now let's get into the skills. Like I said, I'm on level 45, so bear with me on that. I haven't started working on my Paragon tree to build this even more, but I do have high hopes for this build. So let's get into my expertise right now. I am working on two-handed sword expertise to give me another increase on bleed damage. So direct damage when you increase it, deals bleed over 5 seconds, 18% of the damage you deal. So I'm trying to get this to rank 10, so I'll have the 30% increased bleeding damage for 5 seconds after killing enemy. So that increase gives me even more bleed on top of bleed. So for my skills right now, so I'm using the damage reduction for each nearby bleeding enemy. I have it's not the greatest drop on this one, but it is good. I have some resistances on there. As you can see, I do have a dead perk on this armor piece, which would be the steel grasp. That's okay. I did have this armor piece before. I've unlocked World Tier 3 now, so I can start going in and getting some roses to be able to change that. Barrier generation is very good because I do use a barrier perk on this. So let's go to the armor piece. I do have, this is a newer armor chest plate. I have thorns on it. This was just, it was the best armor plate I had. It was great. This does give me a perk to ground stomp. And again, I have intelligence, which I would rather have strength on, but it gives me damage reduction to close enemies. It's very helpful. So this one actually came with heal for life for each close enemy to you. This is very helpful. It's not necessarily mandatory for this build, but I do enjoy this aspect on this build. It's very helpful. Now the bleeding one for damage reduction, that one's pretty needed for this build. Again, I need to go into World Tier 3 so I can start getting some uniques and some more sacred gear. We will go in that. Let's go to our gauntlets. I have put distance to damaged distance enemies have a chance to be stunned for 2 seconds when they hit you, also dealing 15% increased damage to stunned enemies. This goes into with your stun abilities, your charge and your stomp, to increase the stun effect on your enemies. I have 2 perks, 2 points to rend on this. Physical damage over time, because bleeding damage is damage over time. Physical damage over time. I have overpower damage, because you do proc overpower pretty good on this build. It's not super when you proc more criticals than you do overpower. For my waist piece, I do have the bubble. The when not healthy, you summon a magic bubble. This one I would rather swap to something better, but I have not found something better to swap it to yet. I would probably swap it to one that would increase your damage with core skills or some such that, or some more damage to if you have a barrier. But this one's not bad. It gives me some health on this one. It gives me damage reduction from close enemies and damage reduction in general. Damage reduction is very key on this build because you are tanky with this build because you generate a lot of fortify, but you still need some more damage reduction. And as you can see, I am using damage reduction over time to cancel out the status effect abilities, and I'm using damage reduction while fortified to increase my damage reduction when I become fortified. Onto the boots. So on my boots we have fortified generation, very helpful. This is something you want to look for when using this build. The movement speed for after killing an elite at so-so. You don't necessarily have to have this, but it is pretty good, especially when you're in big groups of enemies in dungeons. Dodge chance, I like to have dodge chance on at least one piece of gear just to give me a little bit extra. Got 24 strength, you know strength is what our skills deal damage with, so that's what we need. Critical strike gains 10% increased movement speed. This one helps out a lot, especially when you're starting to get grouped up with enemies and they're starting to, and some of your stuff's on cooldown. You can use this once you critical strike. You can actually use it to help get away from the enemies. So it's very helpful. Onto my necklace, I am using damage. I would like to have strength instead of willpower, but I don't have the materials to change that at the moment. Movement speed, always needed. Damage with two-handed slashing weapons, very handy. It's not a mandatory, but this will boost your damage up quite a bit because with this skill you're pretty much always going to be using two-handed slashing weapon. You'll use a little bit of dual-wield slashing, but it's primarily two-handed. Because right now my charge is set to dual-wield, and my flay and rend are both set to my slashing weapon, my two-handed slashing weapon. Okay, so now I have the seasonal aspect from the season this year, season Malignant. We have Ground Stomp, creates an earthquake, damage enemies over time, so a certain amount of damage, physical damage over time. While standing in the earthquake, you deal 15% more increased damage. This is where You group your enemies up, you stomp to keep get that earthquake going, and then you can deal a 15% increased damage. That combines with the 15% stun damage, so now you have a 30% buff with just those two pieces of gear. Very helpful. This one, damage to slowed, lucky hit chance is always good. Damage to stunned, you want damage to stunned enemies and damage to slowed enemies, because you will be bleeding enemies, so you will get slowed. Will slow enemies down. That is one of the perks, which I forgot to talk about, which would be passive perk hamstring. Enemies are slowed when healthy for 60%, and then 5% more damage for vulnerable enemies. I do apologize, I did forget to mention that. So now on this we have more resistances, 20% life while not damaged recently. This helps you if you happen to actually have to move around. Say the butcher comes up on you. Yes, you're going to want to run a little bit. You're not going to want to stand there and fight constantly. Again, more fortify generation. This is a fortify build. To fortify to increase your health, which increases your thorns and your damage reduction. Damage to stunned enemies. So like I said, I want as much damage to stunned enemies and damage over time as I can get on this build. You do want your good resistances, but damage over time, if you can get that, and damage to stunned, that's really what you want. Because this is really a burst. It's a damage over time build, but it is a burst damage over time. So you want to stop and stun them, and then do a bunch of damage, and you can move and then come back into the fight. Onto our weapons. Right now I am using two-handed greatsword with the call forth for ancients to also charge with you, dealing 150% base normal damage. So this is pretty much my main go-to when I'm doing this build. 10% critical strike damage. You're doing damage to slowed enemies, damage to vulnerable enemies, damage to close enemies, and all plus stats. These are all like super key for the damaging perks that you want on these builds. Plus 30 for stats, so I do have a mace here. Overpower damage, as I said, we do have a little bit of overpower damage from time to time, but mostly critical strike. So this will give you some passive bonuses since you won't be actually using the two-handed weapon as much. This will still give you passive bonuses so I have some basic attack, damage to injured enemies, so now I have damage to healthy enemies with my slowing effect from my bleed. Now I have damage to injured enemies. This helps out. Do not have an ultimate skill, that's okay, but this is a dead perk. I could swap that once I get some other stuff. Lucky hit chance to execute, very helpful, especially when you're hitting with a bunch of mob enemies at once. So, aspect. Critical strikes with core skills increase your attack speed by 16%. Very helpful. You will be critical striking quite a bit on this build. So this will increase your attack speed and make your attacks faster because you are using a two-handed weapon, so it is slower. Basic attacks on a standard sword. Base attack gain more attack speed. So this gives you just a basic buff to give you more attack speed. Again, damage over time, critical strike damage, damage to injured, and overpower. It's all pretty much the same. I'm using damage over time crystals to get my bleed more damage. My two-handed mace. It's overpower damage, as you know with the two-handed maces. Damage to injured, slowed, damage to bleeding. If you can find weapons with damage to bleeding enemies, that will help you out a lot. It's not one of the more common ones to drop, I'm gonna say, so far since I've been playing. I have another Barbarian that's outside of the season, which I still hasn't dropped that much damage to bleeding enemies. 60 plus strength, so this one was a very good drop. It did drop almost max roll. I did just get this mace recently. As you can see, it's not leveled up yet. I just got it on a dungeon run I went on. This aspect is good. After generating 100 fury, your next core skill creates a dust devil that deals 600 damage to all enemies around. This helps you clear through mobs very quickly because you will be generating fury extremely quickly Well, I wouldn't say extremely. I have seen other builds that deal it quite a bit quicker than me, but you deal it decently quick. This helps you cut through your mobs better, but there is aspect I would say that would be better than this, which would be this one. Deal 25% increased damage while you have a barrier. And again, I do have the barrier perk on my necklace that will generate a barrier when I'm damaging an elite. So this helps you deal more damage when you actually are fighting the elites, especially when hell tides and stuff like that. So as you saw from the beginning video, this thing does chew through elites pretty quickly, and we're about to go out. I'm fixing to take you out, go outside, and we're going to teleport to a place and show you just how well this build runs. Let's see if we can find us a decent one. Let's see if we can find, here we go. Let's go down here and do this cellar. This will show you how this build runs, how I usually attack, because as you know, a cellar is not like the really strongest thing, but this just gives you a general issue of how this can play. I'm fixing to go to World Tier 3, so we will see exactly how well this works. As you can see, the bleed works very well. Now it's in the lightning, but I wasn't taking too much damage. Not even gonna worry about him. He was dead anyway. As you can see, can clear stuff rather quickly. Dungeons are pretty easy to clear. Just if you have to group your enemies, run around a little bit, group your enemies up, use your charge to get them all grouped into one spot. If you can run them into a wall, be the best thing. And then you can rotate the stomp and the shouts around a little bit, but because most of the time if I'm going through a dungeon, most of the time I don't even use the war cry to increase my damage, because my damage just speaks for itself. Especially if you're doing a stun, if you got a stun, it eats the enemies up. But I hope that y'all have enjoyed this build, and if you have any advice for me, or if you have anything you'd like to ask me, just hit me up and let me know. Thank you. Let's kill some more demons out there, guys. Let's get this going. Let's keep this game going. I love this game.